Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Langmore was the kind of place where the sun never seemed in a hurry to rise, and gossip clung to the air like dust on a windowsill. It was a village where chickens wandered across dirt roads like they owned them, and folks made tea not to drink, but to talk. Everything in Langmore moved slow, painfully slow, like honey left out on a cold morning. There were no loud cars, no billboards, no headlines. Just footsteps, sighs, and the occasional bark from old Mrs. Decker's dog. People there knew the names of each other's grandparents, and the color of the curtains hanging in every house. Privacy was like fog. Sometimes it showed up, but never stayed long. And yet, in all its quiet, Langmore carried an unspoken agreement. Certain things were never asked, and certain people were never questioned. Margaret Westcott had lived there all her life, and she'd become fluent in the village's language of silence. She was the woman who brought lemon pies to town meetings, who picked wildflowers with her sons by the creek, and who walked side by side with Paul every Sunday after church, hand barely touching his. To the outside eye, hers was a postcard life. Soft edges, well-worn smiles, and no room for trouble. But even the best painted walls can hide rot beneath, and Margaret had begun to smell something sour in her home, though she couldn't name it yet. She had married Paul Westcott when she was just 21, the kind of age when a heart believes it knows more than it does. Paul was 6 years older, already a man with hands strong from carpentry and shoulders that looked like they could carry burdens, even though, in time, she'd come to learn he was better at building things with wood than building anything with emotion. Their courtship had been brief, as was the way in Langmore. They danced twice at the spring festival, and by summer, Margaret's mother was sewing the hem on her wedding dress. People said they looked good together, that she was quiet and kind, and he was steady and hard-working, two pieces from the same puzzle box. No one ever asked Margaret if she felt seen. No one asked if Paul listened to her when they were alone. Langmore didn't care about feelings, it cared about appearances, and Paul made a fine appearance. In the early years, Margaret convinced herself that love didn't need loud declarations or soft touches. She told herself that stability was enough, that kindness shown to others should count for something. But over the years, the silence between them stretched like old elastic, thin, brittle, always on the verge of snapping. Paul came home every day, washed up, kissed the boys, and ate dinner as though life were a schedule, not a relationship. He never raised his voice. He never lifted a hand. But he also never asked Margaret what kept her up at night. And that absence, so quiet and consistent, began to feel louder than any shout ever could. Their home sat near the bend of the lane, where the lilacs grew thick in the spring, and the river could be heard humming just past the hill. The house was small but neat, painted the color of worn denim, with a porch swing that groaned under the weight of silence more than use. Inside, the walls were lined with hand-carved shelves, and everything had a place. Margaret kept it spotless, not out of pride but out of habit, because when things looked right, she could almost believe they were. The boys, Jamie and Elliot, filled the rooms with noise and questions, and Margaret clung to that noise like a lifeline. She made sure they had warmth, food, and the kind of bedtime stories that made monsters seem far away. But in the quiet hours, when the boys slept and the world held its breath, Margaret would sit by the window with a book she never finished reading, listening to Paul's footsteps in the hallway, always paced, always measured. He was a man of few words and fewer answers. She'd once asked him what his dreams were, and he'd shrugged like she'd asked about weather. Same as any man's, he'd said. Work, eat, rest. Margaret remembered nodding, though inside, something curled up and quietly died. She had dreams too, but they stayed locked in the attic of her mind, collecting dust like forgotten heirlooms. She had stopped keeping track of the anniversaries, not out of spite, but because they began to feel like empty placeholders, dates on a calendar that meant as little as the back of a cereal box. 13 years had passed since the day she said, "I do," and she often wondered what exactly she had agreed to. Paul still touched her shoulder now and then, brief and almost apologetic, like someone reaching for a hot stove. They shared a bed, but not warmth. A life, but not stories. And yet, despite the loneliness that had begun to settle in her chest like an unwanted tenant, Margaret kept going. She tended the garden, brushed Elliot's hair, folded Paul's shirts with the care of someone folding maps to nowhere. Because that's what she'd been taught, that a woman stays. That doubt is a luxury. that good wives don't ask questions. But even as she did all the right things, there were moments when something strange stirred inside her, like a whisper heard through a wall, faint but persistent. She couldn't explain it, but some part of her, a part long buried beneath routine and politeness, was beginning to wake. And when the first letter arrived, folded like a secret and smelling of ink and dust, Margaret didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat at the kitchen table, the clock ticking too loudly behind her, and read it once. Then again. And though the words were few, they echoed in her bones like thunder before a storm. He's not yours. The letter lay flat on the table, its message etched in ink that looked rushed, like the hand that wrote it trembled from urgency or guilt. Margaret stared at it long after her eyes had memorized the 3 words, he's not yours. They were blunt, unadorned, and merciless, stripped of context, but heavy enough to tilt her entire world on its axis. She read it again, slower this time, as though she might uncover a secret buried in the spacing of the letters or the slant of the strokes. The paper itself was ordinary, rough along the edges, yellowish in color, folded twice. There was no return address, no handwriting she could easily place, no stamp that suggested it had passed through anyone else's hands. Whoever sent it had been deliberate. They wanted her to see it, to feel it, but not to trace it. Outside, the world continued without pause. A blackbird flitted across the garden, its wing catching the early light. The hens in the back coop clucked and scratched at the dirt. Somewhere in the distance, a hammer struck wood in Paul's workshop, the rhythm steady and sure. That sound had once soothed her. Now it felt like a live pounding against her ribs. She folded the letter, then unfolded it, folded it again. Her fingers moved on instinct, but her mind spun with questions that had no place to land. Was it a cruel joke? A mistake? A warning? Her heart beat loud enough to be heard in her ears, yet her face remained blank, unreadable, even to herself. She didn't cry. Not yet. There were no tears when the world shifted, only the dizzying realization that the ground beneath her had never been as solid as it seemed. Margaret waited until nightfall before she brought it up. All day, she moved like a woman caught between 2 mirrors, seeing herself in fragments, not knowing which reflection to trust. She boiled potatoes for supper, grated cheese for the boys' favorite pie, and folded Paul's shirts with more precision than usual, as though neatness might restore order. She watched Paul from the corner of her eye, studying the way he scratched his chin or refilled his glass. He looked like the same man who had left for work that morning. But that was the problem, wasn't it? He always looked the part. The illusion had never cracked. At dinner, Jamie chattered about a lost marble, Elliot asked for second helpings, and Paul complimented the crust without lifting his eyes. Normal, painfully normal. But the letter burned in her apron pocket like a live ember. When the boys were asleep and the kettle had cooled to a whisper, she laid the paper on the kitchen table. Paul stood in the doorway, half lit by the hallway lamp, his arms crossed in a way that made her stomach twist. She didn't say anything at first, only pointed to it. He stepped forward, glanced at the message, then back at her. "What's this?" he asked, his voice even. "You tell me," she replied, her tone wrapped in quiet steel. Paul shook his head slowly, like someone watching a dog chase its tail. Some kind of prank, maybe. His words were simple, but they landed crooked. Margaret didn't press him further. Not yet. She knew him too well, knew that if he was hiding something, he'd guard it like a locked drawer. She also knew how to wait. She'd spent years practicing. But long after Paul had gone to bed, she remained at the table, the letter still resting in the same spot. She stared at it as if by sheer will she might peel back its meaning. If the words were a match, she had no idea what kind of forest they were about to set on fire. She told no one, not even Martha, her childhood friend, who had a tongue as sharp as a bread knife and a loyalty to match. Margaret had always trusted Martha with the day-to-day secrets, the minor heartbreaks, the frustrations that came with motherhood and marriage. But this was different. This felt sacred, terrifying, too tangled to speak aloud. So she kept her silence, letting the weight of it settle deep in her chest like a stone at the bottom of a well. Still, her mind refused to rest. She began retracing steps she hadn't considered in years. She thought about Paul's 3-month absence in 2009, the year Elliot was born. He had said he went to help his cousin Thomas fix up a workshop in Norwin, 3 towns over. She hadn't questioned it then. Why would she? Paul wasn't the type to travel often, and he had returned with little more than a sunburn and some new tools. But now that period felt like a curtain, something drawn over a stage she had never been allowed to see. She tried to remember if there had been changes in him after that. Had he become distant? Distracted? She couldn't tell. It all blurred now, like a page left too long in the rain. The past had a funny way of rewriting itself once doubt entered the room. Every memory wore a new face. Every glance took on a shadow. She began checking his drawers, not wildly, but with careful fingers like a thief in her own home. She found nothing at first. Just receipts, screws, notes about wood orders. But the absence of answers was its own kind of noise. She started watching Paul more closely, listening for slips, for pauses that didn't belong. The man she'd once thought she understood had become a stranger in her own kitchen, and she was desperate to read him like a map she'd lost long ago. A week later, the second letter arrived. It was thinner than the first, almost weightless. This one bore no mystery in its packaging, just a folded piece of white paper with 5 words scrawled in black ink. Ask him about 2009. That was it. No name. No punctuation. Just a sentence that pushed harder than the last. Margaret felt her throat tighten as she read it. She wasn't sure if the message came from the same person. The handwriting was neater, more deliberate. The ink didn't smudge. It almost looked professional, as if the sender wanted clarity this time. Her hands trembled just enough for her to notice. This wasn't a prank. Whoever was behind this knew something, something important enough to risk exposure, something dark enough to unravel her entire marriage. She took the letter, pressed it flat beneath the teapot on the counter, and stood there in the kitchen for a long time, her thoughts thick with suspicion. That night, she didn't wait until bedtime. She asked Paul directly. What happened in 2009? She said over the sound of the clock ticking behind them. He blinked, startled, then frowned. What do you mean? He asked, his voice tight. When you left for Norwin. Who were you with? Paul didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his glass, drank, and kept his eyes on the floor. Why are you bringing this up now? He murmured. And there it was, the deflection, the dodge, the signal flare of guilt. Margaret didn't push. She didn't scream. She just nodded slowly, every beat of silence confirming what the words refused to say. Whatever happened in 2009, Paul had no intention of telling her. Not freely. And in that moment, Margaret knew the truth wouldn't come knocking. It would have to be unearthed. The days that followed settled into a strange, brittle silence, the kind that didn't feel like peace but like a waiting room before something irreversible. Margaret moved through the house like a woman walking barefoot on glass, careful, deliberate, trying not to bleed. She folded the second letter into a napkin and hid it beneath her sewing basket, as if cloth and thread might muffle the weight of it. She stopped asking questions, at least out loud, but her eyes began to speak in glances, and her movements carried a heaviness Paul could feel, even if he refused to name it. He'd always been good at dodging emotion. To him, life was a series of tasks: fix the roof, clean the gutters, sand the cabinets, sleep. Margaret had once mistaken that steadiness for security, but now it felt like an echo in a place where conversation used to live. She watched him now, not with longing, not even with anger, but with the kind of distant curiosity one might use on a broken clock, wondering what gear had rusted, what spring had snapped. Paul was quieter than usual, and though he never mentioned the second letter, she saw the way his hand hovered longer on the mail each morning, like he feared what might be waiting. He didn't ask Margaret what she knew. That alone told her everything. Because when a man fears the truth, it's not what others might say that haunts him. It's what someone close might finally see. Margaret had always taken pride in her routines. There was a rhythm to her life she once found comforting. The way flour felt between her fingers, the scent of rosemary steeping in broth, the precise creak of the hallway floorboard near Elliot's room. But now, the rhythm felt hollow, like a song she'd heard too many times without ever learning the words. She still woke early, still watered the plants, still ironed Paul's shirts, but her mind wandered in directions it had once been too afraid to go. She thought about the way Paul flinched when she said 2009, how his jaw tightened and he reached for his glass like it contained an escape. She remembered the months he'd been gone, the brief, vague letters he'd sent, always signed with love, always missing any real details. She hadn't questioned it back then because the world hadn't given her permission to. Wives in Langmore were taught to trust their husbands, to measure time by meals and not mysteries. But trust, she now understood, was a strange kind of inheritance, passed down more than earned. And hers was starting to feel counterfeit. In the quiet hours between dusk and sleep, she began writing things down in a small notebook she kept tucked between the pages of a recipe book. Names, dates, patterns, a list of Paul's contacts in Norwin. The cousin he'd claimed to help hadn't been mentioned in years. Thomas Westcott. She remembered the name like a faint perfume. She circled it in ink. Margaret didn't know what she was chasing exactly, only that something was running from her, and whatever it was, it had Paul's shadow. It took her a week to summon the courage to call Norwin's public directory, and even longer to piece together what little information she could find. There was no Thomas Westcott listed, no workshop matching Paul's story. A few old addresses came up under the Westcott name, but none with a current listing. Still, Margaret pressed on like a woman walking into fog, trusting only her instincts. She began asking subtle questions at the general store, to neighbors who might have known Paul before they married. Most shrugged or offered fragments. Oh, he was always private. Kept to himself, even as a boy. No one ever had anything bad to say, only that he was quiet, responsible, someone you could trust with your tools and never worry. But Margaret had begun to see how dangerous that word, quiet, could be. It didn't always mean gentle. Sometimes it meant concealed, controlled. A quiet man could hide a scream under his breath and call it peace. One evening, while sorting through a chest of old receipts and tax papers in the attic, Margaret found a torn envelope with a Norwin Clinic logo in the corner. The name printed below made her breath catch. It was partially torn but still legible, Hartwell Women's Center. The year? 2009. The ink had faded, but the address was intact. Her hands trembled as she held it, the paper soft from age but stiff with implication. Why would Paul have anything from a women's clinic in Norwin? Why would he keep it? She slipped the envelope into her coat pocket like a thief stealing from her own life. Something was unraveling, and the thread was leading straight to a place she'd never been, but Paul had. Paul had noticed the shift. He wasn't a man of words, but he wasn't blind either. He saw the way Margaret had grown distant, not cold, not cruel, but quiet in a way that wasn't her. She had always been composed, calm, the kind of woman who ironed even the inner corners of pillowcases. Now her hands shook slightly when she poured his tea. She didn't look him in the eye as often, and he knew better than to ask. Because the thing about men like Paul, men who had buried things deep, is that they could feel the soil start to move before anyone picked up a shovel. He began coming home later from the workshop, spending more time fixing tools that didn't need fixing. His conversations with the boys grew shorter, and even his laughter sounded rehearsed, like something borrowed from memory. He started double-checking locks, turning off lights twice, as though afraid of what might appear in the dark. At night, he stared at the ceiling while Margaret pretended to sleep beside him. There were no fights, no outbursts, just that aching, unbearable stillness. It was the kind of silence that grew teeth. Margaret, for her part, had stopped waiting for confessions. She was no longer looking for apologies. She was looking for facts, for paper, for names that hadn't been spoken. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the years of nodding and smiling and swallowing her doubts, a voice had begun to rise. Not loud yet, but insistent. A voice that said, "Keep digging." Margaret arrived in Norwin just after noon, the sky bruised with a restless gray that made the town look older than it was. The journey had taken nearly 3 hours by bus, and the motion had done little to calm the storm rolling in her chest. Norwin didn't resemble Langmore in the slightest. It was louder, dustier, and less familiar. Rows of tired buildings lined the streets like crooked teeth, and the people walked faster, spoke louder, looked away quicker. She clutched the envelope from the Hartwell Women's Center inside her coat pocket, her fingers tightening around it every time she passed a stranger. There was no one here she knew, and that, strangely, made her feel more grounded. There were no eyes watching from lace-curtained windows, no familiar voices asking if she was all right, no assumptions trailing behind her like smoke. Just buildings, strangers, and the distant hum of traffic. It felt like walking through someone else's memory. She didn't know what she expected from the clinic. Maybe a receptionist who'd glance at the paper and nod solemnly, a file pulled from a drawer that explained everything. What she found instead was a small, square brick building sandwiched between a laundromat and a florist, its windows dusted with sun-faded privacy film, and its door sticking slightly at the hinge. Inside, the walls were lined with brochures that looked untouched, and a soft classical melody played from a speaker near the ceiling. A woman with kind eyes and graying curls greeted her from behind the counter, asking if she had an appointment. Margaret hesitated, then leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "I'm looking for records from 2009. There was a woman here. I think she might have known my husband." The receptionist's expression shifted, barely but enough. A pause. A small, deliberate breath. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "We don't release patient information without proper authorization." Margaret nodded, forcing a tight smile, but she could feel the answer forming not in the woman's words, but in her hesitation. There was something here, and it was beginning to whisper louder than the rules. She didn't leave immediately. Margaret lingered near the floral shop next door, pretending to examine the blooms, her eyes flicking back to the clinic's door every few minutes. She didn't know what she was waiting for, a name to be dropped, a face to emerge, a clue to fall into her lap, but waiting felt better than walking away empty-handed. Eventually, the woman from the clinic stepped out for a smoke, her sweater pulled tight around her shoulders. Margaret approached slowly, the way one might approach a stray dog, wary but determined. "I don't mean to intrude," she said softly, "but I think my husband may have been involved with someone who came here. She died around the time our son was born. I don't know what's true anymore." The woman exhaled, the smoke curling between them like fog. "We see a lot of people," she said after a pause. "A lot of pain walks through that door. Some of it never leaves." Her voice was tired, not from age, but from carrying too many stories that didn't belong to her. Margaret felt the weight of that, and for a moment, they stood in silence, bound not by information but by the heaviness of unspoken truths. Then the woman added, almost as an afterthought, "There was one, she came in scared, pregnant, didn't say much. Always wore long sleeves, even in July. The man she came with told the nurses they were married, but none of us believed it." Margaret's throat tightened. She didn't respond, just waited. The woman flicked her cigarette to the curb, watching the ash scatter. "She didn't make it through labor. The baby lived. A girl. Social services took her. The man disappeared not long after." Margaret felt the world tilt slightly beneath her. A girl. A death. A man who vanished. She didn't need to hear Paul's name to know. The silence that followed was thick enough to swallow air. The woman's eyes softened. "Whatever you're looking for," she said, "you already know." Margaret thanked her, barely, and turned away before her knees could betray her. Her steps were steady, but inside she felt something break, quietly like a thread pulled too tight for too long. The ride back to Langmore felt endless. The countryside blurred past her window in muted greens and grays, but Margaret saw none of it. Her mind was a theater now, replaying the nurse's words in loops, splicing them into the letters, the hesitation in Paul's voice, the way he never quite looked her in the eye anymore. The pieces were all falling into place, and yet it didn't bring relief. If anything, it made her feel heavier. She hadn't just uncovered a lie. She had stumbled upon an entire chapter of Paul's life that had been buried so deep, not even time had managed to rot it away. A girl. A lost child. A woman who died afraid. Margaret pressed her forehead against the window, her breath fogging the glass. She imagined what that woman must have felt, isolated, betrayed, clinging to hope in a clinic room with no name on the door. Was she younger than Margaret? Older? Did she believe the lies Paul told her? Did she know about Langmore? About the woman waiting at home, folding laundry and writing grocery lists while her husband built a separate life from scratch? The questions were bottomless, each one darker than the last. And then came the thought Margaret couldn't escape. Did Paul love her? Was that why he never spoke of her? Or was it guilt? She didn't know which answer hurt more. As the bus rocked gently over a pothole, Margaret reached into her coat and pulled out the torn envelope again. She stared at the faded clinic logo, tracing its outline with her thumb. This piece of paper had led her into a world she never asked to enter. And now nothing felt familiar, not her home, not her marriage, not even her own reflection. By the time she stepped off the bus, the sky had darkened, and Langmore was dipped in twilight's quiet hush. Her boots crunched softly over gravel as she walked the path back to the house. The windows glowed faintly from the inside, shadows shifting behind curtains. She didn't go in right away. She stood at the edge of the garden, staring at the porch swing where Elliot had once fallen asleep in her lap after a long summer day. That image came uninvited, like a ghost from a kinder time, and for a fleeting second, she longed to go back to before the letters, before the envelopes, before the doubt had bloomed into certainty. But she couldn't go back. Not now. Not ever. When she finally opened the door, the scent of baked potatoes and rosemary greeted her, familiar and cruel. Paul sat in his usual chair, reading the paper, one leg crossed over the other. He looked up briefly and offered a small nod. "You were out late," he said. Margaret didn't answer. She hung her coat, placed her bag gently on the bench, and sat across from him. Her eyes held him, steady and unblinking. "Paul," she said, her voice calm and low, "I went to Norwin." His expression faltered, just slightly. A flicker in the eyes. A pause too long before his reply. "What for?" he asked, but he already knew. Margaret leaned forward. "I met someone. She told me about the girl. About the mother. About you." Silence fell between them, but it wasn't empty. It was dense with everything unsaid. Paul didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He just exhaled slowly, like a man who'd run a long way only to find he was never being chased. He was simply circling the same truth he'd been hiding from himself. Margaret sat back in her chair. Her heart was no longer racing. It had settled now into something clearer, something final. And though the house still stood, she knew the foundation had shifted beyond repair. The following days unfolded not like scenes in a drama, but like pages in a forgotten book, turned slowly, deliberately, the ink fading just enough to demand effort. Margaret continued to wake before the sun, though not out of habit anymore. It was no longer the rhythm of chores or the whispers of motherhood that stirred her from sleep, but the unshakable sense that her life had tilted just far enough off-center to be irreparable. She moved through the house with a new kind of caution, as though each room had become unfamiliar, and every sound might carry a buried meaning. Paul remained distant, not in a dramatic way, but in the kind that builds gradually, like fog thickening until you no longer see your own feet. He no longer asked where she went. He no longer offered explanations. Something between them had broken, not with a crash, but with a quiet snap that neither of them acknowledged aloud. Elliot and Jamie still played in the yard, still laughed about silly things over dinner, but Margaret noticed the way they watched her now, carefully, like children who sensed a change in weather before the clouds arrived. She answered their questions with smiles that didn't reach her eyes. There was no more pretending, not for herself. Every hour, every glance, every quiet moment became a reminder that the man she shared a home with was no longer just a mystery. He was a riddle built on a mission. Her love had not died overnight. It had simply outgrown its ignorance. Paul had stopped trying to reclaim normalcy. He ate without conversation, worked without explanation, and avoided her gaze in that way people do when they fear being seen too clearly. Margaret noticed how he busied himself in the garage more than usual, reorganizing tools, sanding wood that didn't need sanding, oiling hinges that hadn't squeaked in years. He no longer filled the silence with hums or idle stories about neighbors. Instead, he existed like a ghost tethered to the living world by habit alone. One evening, while folding laundry in their bedroom, Margaret heard footsteps pause by the doorway. She looked up to find Paul standing there, his face unreadable, his mouth partially open. For a moment, she thought he might speak, might tell her the things he had hidden, the reasons why. But the words never came. He turned and walked away, his shadow stretching long in the hallway light. That non-conversation haunted her more than any confession would have. It was the final proof she didn't need but received anyway. He was never going to say it. And even if he did, what good would it do now? Words, after a certain point, become like wet matches. No matter how often you strike them, they refuse to spark. So Margaret turned her attention inward. She began collecting every detail, every sign, every sliver of truth, not to confront Paul again, but to remind herself that she wasn't imagining this. That the woman in Norwin had lived. That a child had been born. That Paul had disappeared into a story with another woman while Margaret had been home, scrubbing floors and naming children after his family. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of day that started with promise but turned sideways by afternoon. Margaret had just returned from the post office when she saw a figure standing near the edge of the old well by the orchard trees. The girl couldn't have been more than 17. She had dark, wavy hair that caught the light with streaks of auburn, and her coat was too thin for the weather. Margaret felt something in her body go still. Not fear, but recognition of what she didn't yet know. The girl turned slowly, and their eyes met. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't theatrical. It was quiet, almost eerie in its calm. "You live here?" the girl asked, her voice clear but soft. Margaret nodded, not trusting her own. "I'm Elsie," the girl said. "Elsie Hart." The name hit Margaret like a low note played in the wrong key. She had never heard the name spoken aloud, yet it felt intimately known. "I'm looking for someone," Elsie added, her eyes never leaving Margaret's. "A man named Paul Westcott. I think he's my father." The world didn't spin. The sky didn't darken. Instead, everything around them stood perfectly still, as if the trees themselves had paused to listen. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She only stepped closer and said very gently, "I think you better come inside." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret had unfolded the first letter, where she'd once poured tea without knowing her entire life had a shadow. Elsie didn't fidget. She wasn't nervous, only careful with her words. She said she had been living in a group home 2 towns over until she turned 17 and was given access to her birth records. That's how she found the name. Paul's name. Margaret listened, nodding, offering warmth when appropriate, silence when necessary. It wasn't lost on her how composed this girl was, how calm in the face of something so enormous. Margaret wondered if she had inherited that from her mother. Elsie reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather notebook, thick with pages that had seen too much time and not enough peace. Drawings, clipped articles, letters to no one. Margaret flipped through them carefully. At one point, her eyes stopped on a sketch of a man, angular jaw, watchful eyes, hair swept back just like Paul's had been in his younger years. The resemblance was too clear to deny. "I don't want money," Elsie said. "I just want to know." Margaret met her gaze. "So did I," she whispered. The room fell into a hush again, not empty this time, but full of possibility, of sorrow, of shared space. When Paul returned home later that evening, Margaret didn't greet him at the door. She stayed seated at the kitchen table beside the daughter he'd never spoken of, the one whose name he never dared mention. And when he entered the room and saw her, his face didn't change, but his eyes did. It was the first time in years Margaret saw fear in them. Real fear. Not of being caught, but of finally being seen. Paul stood in the doorway longer than usual, his hand still gripping the knob behind him, as if unsure whether to shut the door or walk back out through it. The air inside the kitchen had changed. It wasn't colder, yet it felt stripped of comfort, like a familiar room emptied of furniture. The clink of the clock above the stove filled the silence, ticking with the indifference of time passing whether people were ready for it or not. Elsie didn't stand up, and neither did Margaret. They both sat there, side by side, not in opposition but not quite in alliance either. Margaret didn't say his name. She didn't soften her face. She just watched him in the way someone watches a slow-moving fire, not panicked, not passive, just alert to what might burn next. Paul finally took a step forward, his boots dragging against the floor in a rhythm that sounded heavier than it should have. His eyes moved between the two of them, then landed on the worn notebook Elsie had placed on the table. For a moment, he looked as if he might reach for it, but his hand stopped short. "I didn't know she'd come," he said, voice thin and dull. Margaret tilted her head slightly. "But you knew she existed." Her tone wasn't sharp, yet each word felt deliberate, chosen with the precision of someone who had waited too long to be careless. Paul nodded once, then dropped his gaze to the floor, as though looking her in the eye might cause something permanent to crack. "I was going to tell you," he added, the words lacking conviction. Elsie's face didn't shift. Her eyes remained steady, almost analytical, like someone trying to measure the difference between truth and regret in real time. Margaret reached for the notebook, turned a page slowly, and set her fingers against a penciled drawing of a woman, thin, quiet, beautiful in a sad sort of way. "Is this her?" she asked. Paul looked and nodded. Her name was Claire. It was the first time Margaret had ever heard the name. The name alone didn't open the floodgates, but it left a fracture wide enough for silence to leak through. Paul took the seat across from them, but it was clear that he had never felt farther from Margaret. He looked older in that moment, not in years but in wear. There was a slouch in his shoulders that hadn't been there before, and the skin around his eyes looked thinner, like it had forgotten how to rest. He tried to explain things, though even as he spoke, it was clear he was no longer defending himself. Claire had been someone he met in Norwin, when he'd left Langmore under the pretense of helping his cousin. There had been no cousin. Just distance, just space, just a need to run from the weight of expectations he didn't know how to voice. Claire had been fleeing something too, though he never asked enough questions to know what. "We were two people hiding from different things," Paul said. "And for a while it felt like we could hide together." Margaret listened with her hands folded. There was no interruption, no dramatic reaction. She had moved past anger. She was now in a place deeper and quieter, where disappointment wore the face of understanding. Paul described how Claire had grown ill near the end of her pregnancy, how she feared hospitals, feared being found. She trusted no one. When she died in labor, the baby, Elsie, was handed over to child services because Paul had no legal claim. No paperwork, no proof. Just a broken heart, and a fear so big he couldn't bring himself to tell the truth. "I buried her alone," he said. "Not even a stone. Just a name in my head." He looked up, finally, as though expecting forgiveness to be hiding somewhere in Margaret's expression. But there was nothing there to comfort him. Just eyes that had seen too much too late. Margaret rose first. She didn't excuse herself, didn't announce anything. She simply stood and left the room. Upstairs, she moved through the bedroom they had shared for over a decade and began folding clothes. Hers, the children's, even Paul's. Her movements were slow, not frantic. There was no chaos, no anger tipping things over. Just precision, purpose, and an eerie calm that comes only when a person has finally made a choice they can live with. She pulled a travel bag from the closet, the one they hadn't used since Jamie was a baby. Everything she touched once, no second thoughts, no doubling back. When she zipped the bag shut, she sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, staring at the familiar walls. The photographs, the curtains, the worn patch in the carpet where Paul always placed his boots. She was not just leaving a man. She was stepping out of an entire version of herself that she had outgrown. Downstairs, Paul remained at the table, still seated across from the daughter he never raised. Elsie hadn't spoken in several minutes. When Margaret returned, she placed the bag near the door and looked at Elsie, not Paul. "Do you have somewhere to stay?" she asked gently. Elsie hesitated. "Not really," she admitted. Margaret nodded. "You can come with us if you want." It wasn't an invitation laced with sentiment, just one born of quiet conviction. Paul stood, finally finding his voice again. "Where are you going?" he asked. She turned to him, and for the first time in years, she saw confusion in his face. Not fear, not pride, just the bewilderment of a man realizing too late what he never truly had. "Away," she said. "Somewhere I can breathe." They left the next morning before the sky had fully committed to sunrise. The streets of Langmore were still asleep, the windows dark, the air carrying the damp chill of pre-dawn. Margaret drove in silence, her eyes fixed on the road as the fields blurred past. Elsie sat beside her, quiet but not tense. The boys, still drowsy in the back seat, didn't ask questions. Margaret had explained only what they needed to know, that they were going on a trip, that things would be different for a while, that sometimes grown-ups have to make choices that don't make sense right away. She knew they would understand more as time passed. Children always did. They were better at letting go than the adults who tried so hard to hold things together. The town slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror, but Margaret didn't look back. Not once. Her hand stayed steady on the wheel, her breath even, her mind finally free from the spinning. She wasn't running away. She was walking forward. There was no destination, not yet. Just the road, the silence, and the company of a girl who had survived the very thing Margaret had unknowingly lived beside. They didn't need to speak much. Some bonds weren't made of words. They were made of understanding, of shared silence, of two women, strangers by blood, connected by truth, rebuilding something from the ashes of what had been hidden for too long. And though Margaret knew life ahead would be complicated and uncertain, one thing was clear. She had finally reclaimed her voice. And she would never let it be silenced again. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than words. If something feels off, trust that feeling. You are not wrong for asking questions. You are not too much for wanting truth. And you are never selfish for choosing peace over appearances. Love should never cost you your voice or your worth. Don't wait until you're broken to realize you deserve more. The moment you start choosing yourself is the moment healing begins. May your heart never settle where it is slowly breaking. May your spirit be guarded from silent betrayals, and may truth always find its way to you, gently but clearly. May the peace that passes all understanding wrap around you like soft light in the darkest hour. May you walk boldly away from anything that dims your light, and may every step forward lead you closer to joy, to freedom, and to the version of you that refuses to shrink. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.